Did it start? I guess it did. So we're going to go ahead and start. I think probably Isidore and Marcelo will come in still. I think they were planning on being here unless something happened, but it's great to have Bob, Darren, Stephanie, my wife, and this is week 2 of personal evangelism. Let me go ahead and pass this around, and you guys be sure to check in. And tonight, oh yeah, you bet, sweetheart. Tonight what we're talking about is we're going to look at 2 different books, Evangelism in the Early Church by Michael Green and Organic Church by Neil Cole. I'll have just some comments about both of those. Last week, what I did, just to refresh, is we studied the book of Leviticus, which is probably not the place that you would typically think of to start in personal evangelism. But basically that whole teaching in a nutshell was the idea of purchasing a field because of the potential for that field, knowing that you could get so many crops out of it before the year of Jubilee rolled around. And that idea of atonement is exactly what Jesus fulfilled with his life. And so it became sort of this launching pad for really this class on evangelism. And it's basically this idea: don't ever look at somebody and write them off and say, oh, they'll never amount to anything. Just, you go ahead and purchase that field in faith anyways, and you go ahead and invest in people, because you just never know what God may be planning to do in their lives. Now, so tonight we're going to look at these 2 books, but before we get into them, I want to, there's not a lot of scriptures that I'm reading tonight. I would encourage all of you, if you didn't get to see it last week, to go back and look at that section where we really dug into a lot of scriptures. But tonight there's really 2 verses that I want to share. They should shake us at the core of who we are if we really take these verses at face value. And one of them is Colossians chapter 4, verse 6. Paul wrote to church in the town of Colossae, and he tells them something that is really important when it comes to the idea of personal evangelism and sharing our faith. Colossians 4:6 reads like this: let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Read it again. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. Recently I read one of the Proverbs, and I'm not going to read it necessarily, but just I'm reflecting on this. The proverb that says, a wise man thinks before he speaks. Have you guys ever read that one? And I will confess to you that I'm guilty of not always following that practice. Have any of you ever been guilty of not following that practice? Have you ever been guilty of engaging the mouth and speaking, and then after it's about halfway out of the sentence, then you go, I should have really thought about this before I just started speaking. You know, we're supposed to think before we speak. And so we're supposed to let our conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you know how to answer everyone. I mean, that just gives the perfect picture. I imagine food that has just the right amount of seasoning, not too much. Did you ever have anyone play a prank on you where they pulled the lid off of the salt shaker, and maybe you were going to just sprinkle a little on your hamburger or something, and all of a sudden it just poured on there? You want to sprinkle your surroundings with salt. We are the salt of the earth. We are the light of the world. And just the right amount of seasoning is perfect. So I pray that God helps us to do that. You know, this verse, if you think about it too hard, you can allow it to be intimidating. I mean, at least I will admit, to me, it can be a little intimidating to think, you mean I've always got to have an answer? What if I don't have the answer? You know, am I the only one that's ever felt that way? What if they ask me a question and they stump me and I just stand there looking like an idiot? You know, oh no, what would happen? Well, did you know, what I found out is that people just really very rarely do they ask questions that are like deep questions. Sometimes they do. I had one recently. Our neighbor over here is, I mean, the immediate next door neighbor to the church is a professing atheist, and he's become a friend. We've had deep conversation, and I think what he appreciates about me is that I'm not going to hammer him over the head and say, no, I disagree with you. We're going to talk on an intellectual level. I'm going to point out to him and say, yeah, I just totally disagree with you. Sometimes I'll say, well, you know, you bring up a good point. But what I've learned is that in that relationship, very rarely is there a really super hard question that I have to wrestle through. Most of the time, people just want to know that you care about them. People just really want to know that you love them. That's all. And so, if you ever do find yourself in one of those situations where you say, man, I don't know the answer to that question, you can always do this. You can just say, there's this guy named Darren down at church, he can answer that for you. And, right? Okay. We'll point all of our questions to Darren. Then there is one other verse, and it's 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. 1 Peter 3:15. But in your hearts, set apart Christ as Lord. Always be willing to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope you have. Always be willing to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Now be honest. Are we always ready? Are we always prepared? I'd like to think that we are, but that's a little intimidating too. But I will share, and I'm not sure if it's 2 weeks from tonight or further in the study, but Bill Hybels, who wrote one of the books that we'll look at during this study, gives this story about when he was literally getting off the side of a boat and climbing down the boat to exit from an evening with friends, and they had already said goodbye, and he's leaving, and just as he's literally stepping off to get on, I think he called it the dungey, to go back to shore, and he said they leaned over the railing and said, can you tell us, what does it really mean to be a Christian? And he had 30 seconds. I thought about that. Well, what would I do? Well, thankfully, he had a strategy. If he had a 30-second window, he had something that he could say to really boil it down, bring it down to the brass tacks, and say, here's what it's really all about. And I'm going to share that story, like I say, in one of these lessons. But we're always to be ready to give a reason for the hope that we have. And these two verses, I really ask you to consider these verses and to pray about them. And what if we really did take these two verses to heart? What if we really, as believers and followers of Jesus, took it seriously? How would that affect the way we live? How would that affect our church, our community, if we really were always thinking, what can I say if someone asks? What will I speak if I get a window of opportunity? Because here's what I believe. I think as Christians, we must have a little synopsis of our life story ready to share. And the truth is, very seldom do we get those opportunities to sit with someone for an hour conversation. Sometimes you get that, and that's wonderful. Sometimes you get extended conversations. And I'm telling you, I have begun to celebrate conversations. I celebrate salvations but I also try to seriously appreciate the chance when I get to talk with someone, because that's a rare thing. And if you get the chance to speak into someone's life, boy, that's prized possession. But so if you do have those 30-second slots or a 60-second venue, and maybe you're at some meeting and you get a 60-second window. I've had this happen where you get the chance to talk. Something to say, have something ready to share that will make people think, there's something different about him, there's something different about her. Okay, so Michael Green, Evangelism in the Early Church. Michael Green's a historian. This is not popular reading. Some of the other books that we're going to read are like popular style. Neil Cole's Organic Church, and we'll look at Bill Hybels. We'll look at a book by Rick Richardson, and those are more enjoyable, popular reading. This isn't. This is, he's a historian. It's a history of the early church. And in particular, he targets how did they do evangelism in the early church. It's academic, it's heady, and if you're not into that sort of thing, you might get bogged down. But if you enjoy digging deep and reading that style, I'd really recommend it. It's a wonderful book. In it, he talks about how Christians in the early church would go to where people are, and they would use every available means to get a chance to witness for Jesus Christ. They would go to the stadium where the athletes would compete. That sort of sounds like an outreach event to me, in our terminology. They went to the synagogue in the city because they knew that's where it was a gathering place, and people would be at the synagogue, so they would go. They would use what they called love feasts. We call them potlucks. Every Wednesday night we have a love feast. But they used the methods of the day. I wanted to share with you an ancient Latin poem that was found. It's been uncovered in numerous places in archaeology. Michael Green talks about it. It's called the Rhodes Square, and it's called a palindrome. Do you guys remember that word? I think Darren will remember this because I had forgotten about this, and I asked just the other day, I was asking Heather, what does palindrome mean? Because it says that on the computer. And a palindrome can be the same frontwards and backwards. And this is called the Rhodes Square. It's in Latin. My writing looks like Latin sometimes, but it's supposed to, anyway. It's supposed to be something you can recognize. Sower. Okay, so this is it's called the Rhodes Square, and it is, the wording would be arepo. Well, if you read the 5 words, rotas apero tene, arepo sator. It's translated this way. It means arepo, a man who's named Arepo, which I don't have a neighbor named Arepo, but apparently back then they did. Arepo the sower, like the farmer. Arepo the sower holds the seed with care. That's how this would translate. And somebody might look at that and say, oh, isn't that cute? But there's an underlying meaning. One translation of how this could be translated is, the one who sows the seed holds the spheres. The implication being, God who gives the seed of the good news holds the wheels. Now, if it's a farmer, then you're thinking of like a wheelbarrow. But wheels can mean like the spheres of the universe, the planets. The one who sows the seed holds the sphere. So, in ancient times, the Romans were fond of putting crosses at intersections. Not the kind of cross where people hang and die, although they did that too. In fact, there was one occasion, I just can't believe when I read about this, one occasion there were 300 thieves dying on crosses between one town and another, and the emperor put them all on crosses and make an example of them. So not everybody that died on a cross died in 6 hours time like Jesus did that day. It was, they would stay on the crosses for days and days, and sometimes it became very grotesque as they became emaciated and just were decaying their bodies, you know, just as they're living, dying. Birds would come and land on them and peck them, and there were 300 of them lining the highway. This is a warning. You do not mess with the emperor. And if that's a little too gross for you, I'm sorry, but that's the reality of how they did it. But now they also had crosses when you would have a crossway. Two roads come together, and there would be a cross that would have two signs on it pointing in each direction which way to go. Well, one place in Pompeii at the stadium, and archaeologists have dug and tried to figure it all out. They decided it must have been an athlete who did this, but he took the Rhodes square, which this is Latin, and played with it and wrote out on a cross like it was a street sign. And what he did was take the exact same letters and put them together, and he did it this way. And what it represents, you can see it in both of these, but now what he did, this is amazing to me. This is Latin. But he took those letters and made it into Greek. Pater Noster means our Father. Pater Noster, our Father. And Alpha and Omega, surrounding the cross of Christ. See, and you see it in this one too. T is the ancient symbol for the cross, and yet each place you have the T, you have the Alpha and the Omega surrounding the cross. So what we believe is that actually archaeologists are digging, they're finding this stuff, and they're saying, what is this, some playful ancient poem, or what do we have here? What we believe is this is one of the very first gospel tracts. I mean, we think that we got some slick gospel tracts now, you know, printed in color, and you can hand it out and you say, here's the story of Jesus, and confess your sins and believe. This was phenomenal. And I mean, when I think of that, it blows me away. Now, I'm going to erase this, though, and talk about, for a moment, what Michael Green talks about in his book, three different important things that happened in the history of the early church that affected evangelism. The first one was violence. There has never been a time, really, since the beginning of mankind where there were no wars. But it's interesting to study it, and he points this out. Before the time of Christ, violence was very high in the earth, but along about 150 years before the time of Christ, Rome had this thing called Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. Basically, the idea was, we're going to annex you in to be part of our empire. And if you choose to be, we'll let you keep worshiping the way you want to and all that. You give your taxes to us, of course. And if you choose not to, then we'll slit your throat. I mean, it's your choice. And, but the reality was that it was a real time of peace for about 150 years before the time of Christ. Wars went down, and I'm going to depict this with 3 different colors so that hopefully you can see what I'm trying to get at tonight. But interestingly, after the time of Christ, wars increased again, violence increased again, and so that the life of Christ was just a window in which violence and wars really scaled way, way down compared to what they were previously. Now, the second thing that he talks about, and incidentally, I think it's interesting that Jesus, one of his names is the Prince of Peace. And even though wars did not totally go away, and even though Jesus himself made the statement, there will be wars and rumors of war and famine in various places, and this will be a sign of the end time. But when he physically lived on this earth, it was just sort of like the parting of the seas, just whoosh. There was this season of peace. The violence went down. He lived. He died. He rose again. He ascended back to the Father. And then slowly over the next 150 years, you see the violence increasing again. The second thing that Michael Green points out is roadways. Now, we might tend to think, yeah, roads have been around forever and they're just all kinds of different, they were primitive, but they always had them. Well, actually, for centuries and centuries, there were no roadways. You rode horseback, and you rode, maybe they went through the same path and the same trajectory on their journey, but there were not roads. It wasn't until Rome came along that they built roads. They were the road builders. They built magnificent iron chariots. And the reason they built roadways was because until that point, even though there were some other world powers, there were none on the scale of Rome so spread out so far geographically. So the emperor wanted to be able to get from one part of his kingdom to the other part really quick, and so they built magnificent roadways. Probably more important than that, he wanted his soldiers to be able to get somewhere really fast. So, in fact, you can go online and you should search a Gnatian way and just look at some of the pictures. You can still see some of the highway. You can still see the cobblestones and the magnificent roadways. Some of it's been unearthed, but much of it's still intact. One of the hugest ancient highways. Rome, they were road builders extraordinaire. But the interesting thing about that, you kind of think, well, since Rome built those roadways, then it's probably been that way from that time to now. Everybody's built roads. Stephanie and I are Texans. The Texas highway system is unbelievable. I can't believe, like when you go there, there's massive, just huge bridges and the roadway, millions and millions. Just, of course, way beyond millions. Probably, I don't know, is it safe to say billions of dollars? I don't know. A lot. But the reality is, roadways have not been around. They're fairly recent in history. The Roman roads fell into disrepair, and then hundreds of years passed before it's been really modern times before we started building the kind of roads like what was around and comparable to what they had back then. So it's just an interesting study. No roads, no highways being built. Just shortly before the time of Christ, they increased this massive effort of building roads all throughout the Roman Empire, all throughout his world. And then after his life, the roadways go into disrepair and go back until many centuries later when we begin to kind of take up on their idea. Then the last thing, there's 3 of them, they all play into this language. A very interesting study about language, because something amazing happened at the coming of Christ. For hundreds of years, the people of God spoke Hebrew. In fact, in the ancient times, I'll bet if you ask a Hebrew person, what language are we going to speak in heaven, or whatever their concept might be of eternity, well, it would be Hebrew. I mean, it's the language of God. And there were such very specific rules about what to speak and how to articulate it. And honestly, I mean, for 2,600 years, they did not even speak audibly the name of God. It was silence when you get to that in the text, out of respect. Did you know it wasn't until a group of people called the Masoretes came along in 900 AD, 900 years after Christ, they start looking at the Hebrew text and they said, you know what, we better add some vowel markings in here so that people will even know how to pronounce this stuff, because it's changing and it's not even what it used to be. And so they came along, put little dots and underlined scores and markings so that we would know how to pronounce it. But Hebrew, the Hebrew that was spoken in the Old Testament is, for all practical purposes, it's really an ancient dead language. When you study biblical Hebrew, you study a Hebrew that existed then. It's not the same thing that's spoken today, although it's probably closer to what they had back then than Greek is to the New Testament, because Greek has changed totally. The modern Greek is not the same Greek of the New Testament. But language is just an interesting study, because they probably thought, well, Hebrew, that's what is the language of God. And the Messiah is going to come into the Jewish people, and he will be a Hebrew of Hebrews, and I'm sure they just thought they would speak Hebrew. But as time passed, Aramaic became the language that was being used more and more among the Hebrew people. Probably, and I mean I don't know if this study ever really goes away, but the latest trend in recent years, Bible scholars believe that Jesus spoke Aramaic. He definitely would have spoken Aramaic in the area of Palestine that he lived in. And probably, I'd be shocked if he didn't know Hebrew. I would just be shocked if he didn't speak Hebrew. But some people say, well, by the time he lived, he may not have even spoken the Hebrew of the Old Testament. But I think he probably did. And probably, because of the shift that was going on at that time, I think he probably spoke Greek too. The interesting thing is that there was this shift. Again, it's a real shift that was happening right at the point of his life. I'm going to illustrate it this way, and I think it will make it make sense a little more. I know this orange text is hard to read, but Hebrew was spoken, and then it switched to Aramaic, and then right along in here, Greek became what we call the lingua franca, the main language, the master language. And I've got a good joke about that. Let me see if I can remember how it goes. I really do believe that Jesus probably spoke multiple languages, because a lot of people in the world speak multiple languages. I mean, for instance, you know, when someone speaks 3 languages, we call that trilingual. And if someone speaks 2 languages, we refer to that as being bilingual. Do you know what we call it when someone speaks 1 language? American. Because we're the only nation in the world where, I mean, it's getting better. We now require our kids at least to study a language for 2 years, but they don't master a language. But I'm going to tell you something. In China, those kids learn English in school. And it's that way around the world. Actually, right now, even though there's a subtle shift going on even again, but right now, English is in the world what Greek was at the time of Christ, maybe I could say just shortly after the time of Christ. The lingua franca, the main language. It's interesting, Gordy and Becky Miller lived in Mexicali last year. She's telling me that she studied a college level class, this in Mexico, college level class taught in English. In Mexico. Stephanie went on a missions trip to, where is it you went? Belize. Belize, the official language of Belize, down in Central America, South America, Central America. Official language, English. I mean, that's amazing to me. But see, that's kind of how Greek was back at the time of Christ. And then here's the interesting thing that happens. It was about, maybe 200 years after Christ, 250 years, slowly it just changed. Then Latin became the #1 language. And Latin stayed for centuries and centuries, similar to some of the more ancient languages. This is why, even in 1500s, you know, one of the reasons that Martin Luther said this just isn't right. This isn't right to go to church and have Mass in Latin, and we don't even speak Latin. You know, why can't we have it in German? You know, and so. But even to this day, there's still some Catholic churches that will observe Mass in Latin because it was the language. But what I'm trying to point out to you, the life of Christ was this amazing coming together of a season of where violence has ended, and it's a time of peace. It's a season when roadways were built up, and then they went away. It's a season when there's a tremendous shift in language, like hadn't happened. And those things, see, Greek culture, the Hellenization of the known world, it's just amazing that you've got a season of peace, you've got roadways to get people anywhere they want to go. This is the first time people could travel anywhere in the empire. And there's a common language that can be used at all parts of the empire. In other words, it's almost as if God set this thing up perfectly to evangelize the known world that first century. And that's precisely what they did. The Christians went to everywhere that they could, sharing the gospel. I want to share a little bit from Neil Cole's book too, but before we do, let me just double check my time. I got to make sure we